Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Allison Kretzinger, our Director of Public Affairs here at the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. And Renee, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, good morning. I'm Renee Newkirk. I'm the Chief Financial Officer here at DCYF. Thank you so much for joining.
Excellent. Sorry, blurred my background. I realized I was working from home and my webcam is not working. So I also apologize for the bizarre angle in which you were all looking at me today. But you know, such is the joys of life. So thanks so much for joining. Renee and I tend to do these webinars at the end of session as sort of a wrap up to how did the legislative session go for the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, our providers, our clients, our services, etc. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are in webinar format in Zoom. There is a Q&A box in the bottom there, and you can type your chats or your questions in that Q&A box. They come up, we can see them. We will answer them, some of them verbally. Some of them we might type an answer in. Some of them we may not know the answer and we'll need to get back through an FAQ or a feedback loop. So just want to give that bit of housekeeping. We'll go ahead and walk through the various buckets of funding. Spoiler alert, this is a really positive webinar. DCYF had a great legislative session and we're really excited to share with you today all the excitement and the things funded and passed and coming our way. How long will be the webinar? We have about an hour scheduled. It may take that full 60 minutes. It may wrap a little early, but we'll end on time out of respect for folks' time today. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So just as a reminder to ground us in where we are in the process and the timeline, for folks who have joined before, this is very familiar. We have used this for a number of years. This really just maps out the legislative process, what happens and what happens when. Right now, we are in that highlighted bubble of early May, where the governor is reviewing all the bills, including the budget bill, that passed the legislative session and making choices around signatures and working to sign those bills and ultimately sign the budget. Session concluded on April 24th. I do want to flag, because I think it's important to note, the governor has called a special session that will open for 30 days on Monday. There was one policy issue unresolved this legislative session that lawmakers will come back to Olympia to resolve around the Blake decision, or drug possession, crimes and criminal levels, treatment, etc. We do not anticipate the special session impacting anything other than the Blake bill. And I can't remember the number off the top of my head. And so things that have already passed and are already in the queue are in that timeline of needing to be signed in that 20 or 30-day window after the legislative session, including the budget. So the investments we'll walk through today, we anticipate seeing move through that process. Yes, there's a question about the slides. The slides, as always, are posted on the DCYF Government Affairs website post the webinar within the next 48 hours. Maybe by Monday or Tuesday, you should be able to see them there. They're a PDF. You can download them. You can use them for your purposes. And certainly our contact information is there if you have follow-up questions. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So just grounding us in what it was like about 9-10 months ago, maybe even a year ago, as we were building our DPs and heading into the legislative session. The 23 legislative session was a biennial session, a budget setting session. That means there's lots of ideas on the table and lawmakers are setting the operating budget for the state for the next 2 years and projecting out the 4-year. This is when new and innovative ideas come forward, big ideas come forward, etc. We also still at DCYF, fortunately, are grappling with the reality that we are implementing a ton of reform and investments from the pre-pandemic and the pandemic era. Keeping Families Together Act, reforms in the child welfare system, the Fair Start for Kids Act, reforms in JR through community transition services, as well as other treatment and focusing on education there. So DCYF has a lot of work underway and in flight, and that's great. What that means, though, is we're a little more strategic in what we put forward. Because so many large initiatives and things are happening, we did not feel like heading into this session, it was a moment to ask for additional big things that create a ton of change as far as policy reform or practice reform. So just keep that in mind. And, you know, the other reality that we are continued to grapple with heading into the last session was COVID. The impacts of COVID were not equal across the state. The recovery impacted people differently. And that was something we certainly considered as we went forward and built our requests for last year, as well as what the legislature had to grapple with as well. And then the revenue picture. And Renee, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the revenue picture here before we dive into the weeds.
Yes, thank you, Allison. So just wanted to note that based on the March revenue forecast, there was a slight uptick for the remainder of this fiscal year, which ends June 30th, of $194 million. And now we are starting to see, based on the forecast projection, a decrease in our revenue effective next biennium, which is effective July 1st. And that reduction is $483 million. I shouldn't say reduction, I should say a decrease or a decline in projected revenue that we're expecting. So with that in mind, it is really an indication of how much funding we received this session with the decrease in projected revenue, but yet we received significant investment here at DCYF. So a great success for us, a lot to implement, but very, very happy with this session and the outcome. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Allison.
Excellent. So as we walk through, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, we'll walk through a slide or two around relevant pieces of legislation impacting parts of the agency, and then we'll walk through the fiscal investments. I'll walk through the bills here. Renee's going to walk through the fiscal investments, the decision packages or other budget items that were funded, and then we'll sort of tag team the buckets as we move. There's a lot of content, again, which is really exciting. If you attended our pre-session webinar or the governor's budget or our decision package webinar or the governor's budget webinar or the mid-session webinars, a lot of this content is familiar. DCYF is super fortunate that most of what we put forward was fully or mostly fully funded this year. And there were some things that were funded in past that we certainly didn't ask for, but we're very involved in and very aware of. And so again, this is a real positive webinar that we get to give as we talk about session wrap up. So on your screen here now, you see the three pieces of agency request legislation that DCYF put forward. All three of them passed with strong bipartisan support, some of them unanimously all along the way, and strong advocacy support from many of you on the call today. I think that's one of the values we hold at DCYF is ensuring no surprises. And it's really helpful to bring our allies, our advocate partners along as we move legislation forward. And that was really true this year and certainly made the lift of these three pieces of legislation fun and much more enjoyable. So thank you for those of you who worked on them, testified on these bills, wrote emails, wrote to your lawmakers. We certainly felt it. So really briefly, the Family Connections bill with Family Connections pilot was passed a few years ago and then funded. This codifies that and maintains it and increases funding so it can expand. Family Connections is a program that facilitates partnership interaction between foster parents and bio parents when children do have to be removed and placed in out-of-home care with supported peers for both the foster parent and the bio parent. Thrilled to see the investment here and the expansion as well. Another bill we put forward, which also connected to a decision package, which Renee will talk about in a couple of slides, was around housing access and supports in 2019, I think, maybe 2020, I get my years, they all blend together at a certain point. The child welfare housing pilot was passed. This legislation codifies that, moves it beyond pilot phase. It also says these housing resources can be used for prevention of out-of-home placement in addition to reunification. It was limited to reunification previously, and this investment will allow expansion into additional communities for the housing access, both vouchers, the wraparound case management, and support. I'll just highlight huge work by housing authorities, housing providers across the state and the agency, many agency staff to sort of curate a decision package and a piece of legislation that was robustly supported and ready. I think we're ready to hit the ground running on implementation. So excited there. The last piece of agency request legislation expands subsidy to guardianship. So previously, guardianship subsidies were only available to families who exited a guardianship and were 4E eligible. Folks who are in and out of the space here know that 4E eligibility is a fleeting dream for many states. The income threshold for eligibility is tethered to an old mid-1990s federal standard. So less and less families, especially in Washington state, are 4E eligible. And many of our policies historically are tethered to that 4E eligibility because that triggers a federal match. And if they're not 4E eligible, then it's all general fund state. So this bill says, regardless of your income or your eligibility when you enter child welfare, if you exit dependency through a guardianship, you have that subsidy available to you, assuming you meet the other criteria of the law, parallel to the existing guardianship program. So we're really excited about that. It really aligns with the agency's direction and values around guardianships, kin placements, safe exits to permanency. So thrilled to see that move. Additionally, this bill expands placement options to suitable others under voluntary placement agreements. Previously, voluntary placements agreements had a more narrow and limited option of who you could place with. If a parent chose to enter into a voluntary placement agreement, this now expands that to suitable others. All in all, aligns with the direction and the vision and where DCYF is headed as we think about how do we keep families connected and together. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm going to highlight a couple other pieces of legislation that passed this year that were connected to us. This is certainly not an entire list of all the bills in this space. There are other bills that passed that impact us, but these are some of the major highlights. We will post an entire bill list of all the legislation that passed that impacts the agency, either high impact or low impact, when we post the webinar slides. So not everything is on here. We analyzed hundreds of bills this year and hundreds of versions of hundreds of bills and wrote hundreds of fiscal notes. Certainly didn't include all of them, or we'd be here for days. So the first bill here is continuation of some work that was actually funded in a proviso a couple of years ago around prevention services and diagnoses and treatment for young children and children who experience prenatal substance exposure. This was a DCYF body of work until the very last minute and the last stop on the train. It moved to be implemented out of HCA. So this will actually be an HCA implementation, but we will work with them because we have had some of the initial seed dollars through a proviso a couple of years ago. The next bill, House Bill 1188, modifies existing law and changes existing law that makes very clear that children who are involved in foster care and dependency are in fact eligible for services through DDA and developmental disability services. Previously, they were excluded from that. It also requires that the federal waivers that provide DDA services be modified to be clear that children who are involved in foster care and dependency can access those services. There's more resources obviously tethered to this bill. This resource is really about the staffing capacity and the capacity at DCYF, predominantly implemented through DSHS as they run the Developmental Disabilities Administration, but we're thrilled to see this pass and we'll work in partnership with them and coordinated care as this bill and Healthcare Authority in the waiver piece as this bill is implemented. The next, child abuse and neglect, this is 5515. This makes clear DCYF has investigative authority in residential settings where children or youth may reside with a non-custodial parent, including treatment facilities, host homes, residential schools, etc. Previously, our scope of CPS investigation was limited to licensed facilities and where custodial parents resided. This fills some of those gaps, clarifies some of those pieces. It also directs rulemaking for licensure around residential schools. The next bill, 5683, is related to the child-specific license for Indian children. I should just not try to say the years. A couple of years ago, we passed a bill that authorized a child-specific license. And as frankly, oversight did not include explicit authorization for child-specific licenses for Indian children in the care and custody of tribes. So this was a fix to that. Now that we're implementing the child-specific license, this came to our attention. So this was a fix to that and provides clear and explicit authority for child-specific licenses to be issued for Indian children in the care and custody of tribes, and those payments to be offered for those child-specific licenses. And the last bill, 1580, is really in response to the challenges around children stuck in hospitals. This bill came from partners who have been working on this issue. We worked closely on it, and it really directs the governor's office and OFM to create a position and a process for triaging when youth are stuck. What do we do? How do we serve them when the right thing may not exist? So we are excited to see this pass. We'll certainly work in partnership with OFM, Healthcare Authority, DSHS to implement this legislation as well. And with that, we can go to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Renee to walk through the fiscal investments in the child welfare and prevention space.
Thank you, Allison. Just to orient you to the slides, on the left-hand side, you'll notice in particular for this one, the title is prevention, the overarching theme, and under that it says decision package. What that means is a decision package is our vehicle in which we request funding for consideration in the governor's budget. And then if included in the governor's budget, then it's up for consideration by the legislature. So this just simply notes that decision package, this was the origination of these requests, which then some level of funding was included in the governor's budget, ultimately included in the budget as passed by the legislature, which we are presenting today. So the decision package is part of our agency budget submission that we submitted in the fall. So with that, this did originate with the department through a decision package. And what you'll see here, the investments on this slide is to help the department achieve the goal to reduce the number of families entering the child welfare system, as well as to reduce and prevent the number of placements in out-of-home care. So the first investment, SUD prevention, this will really help us to achieve reduced placements. Parental substance use is a contributing factor of child placements, and it contributes to 71% of infant removals across the state. So therefore, to reduce the number of placements, investment is made in SUD prevention, which will connect pregnant people to services before birth and connecting substance-exposed infants and families to services at birth, as well as connecting DCYF involved families aimed at reducing placements to those SUD prevention treatments. Also, the legislature funded a home visiting increase for an average of a 20% rate increase that's effective January 1st of 2024, based on the results of a home visiting cost study. Also, the legislature fund home visiting slot expansion. So some additional slots, approximately a little more than 100 slots is what the $1 million funding will support. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Rising Strong West. This was a decision package that we had submitted in our capital budget. Rising Strong is currently on the east side of the state in Spokane. It's a very successful model, successful program. It's a holistic family-centered drug treatment and housing program, treating the entire family so the family can stay together. Supports include for the parents, SUD treatment, counseling, parenting skills, while the children that are there with their parents will receive quality childcare, educational support, mental health screening and treatment as well. So as I indicated, this has been very successful in Eastern Washington. So we submitted for the west side to construct a site for a Rising Strong model here in Western Washington. And so that was funded by the legislature. Also included in the operating budget was one-time funding to go to the Rising Strong model in Eastern Washington, as well as funding to construct a sustainable operating funding model as this model hopefully expands. Okay, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Housing access and supports. This also originated with the department through a decision package in our budget submission funded by the governor and now by the legislature. So these are critical housing supports provided to young people, which may include support to help them locate housing, supports with an application for housing, and working with landlords. So funding this sort of case management type support is what was funded for those youth that are exiting foster care, as well as our young people exiting the juvenile rehabilitation system. And then as Allison noted previously, the Housing Access and Support Senate Bill 5256. This was also funded by the legislature to continue our child welfare housing assistance program. This funding provides 4 reunification sites where housing supports are necessary for families to reunify, as well as 2 prevention sites to serve families where children are at risk of removal, in part due to housing instability. Okay, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Combined in-home and transition services also originated by the department. This request, combined in-home services are really critical for our families in the reunification, as well as preventing out-of-home placements. So this funding allows the department to provide capacity building grants to providers, as well as the expansion of additional combined in-home services, and as well as ensuring that we're providing culturally relevant in-home services. The YV LifeSet program, this is a program for services provided to youth ages 17, young adults to 22, involved in foster care, the juvenile justice, and mental health systems. This is currently offered in King County and Tri-Cities Yakima area. So this funding maintains those sites, as well as expansion for an additional site in fiscal year 24 and an additional site in fiscal year 25. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. Caregiver placement supports, also originated by the department through a decision package. This is funding that creates equity and financial supports for all caregivers. There's a couple of different components to this. It expands our current foster care maintenance payment system from a 4-level system to a 7-level system. And what that 7-level system will do is it will address the caregiver supports necessary to care for children with varying level of needs. And this is effective January 1st of 2024. Also included here is to ensure that all caregivers, whether you're licensed or unlicensed, receive the same level of supports to care for those children in their care. So all standard supports will be provided for levels 1 through 7, and then levels 3 through 7 will receive case aids. And standard supports will include such as coordinating health services, coordinating childcare, coordinating school supports, etc. And then in addition to that, for levels 4 through 7, we'll also be providing an enhanced level of care for any sort of behavioral health supports that are needed, real-time parenting, training, coaching, etc. So we're really excited about this one, as it really will further create equity in our system, ensuring that all caregivers, regardless of licensure status, will receive the same level of supports. Okay, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So family time, this funding provides what we refer to as separate billables for our family time providers. This is where family time providers are spending their time preparing reports that are necessary for court or critical incident reports. It funds missed visits, canceled visits, and associated reports. So excited to see this funding, and this is effective May 1st. So that was actually just a few days ago, 12 days ago. So this funding is already in effect. DS compliance. Investments made here are to meet the obligations of the DS settlement agreement. This implements reforms to address the placement instability that our youth are experiencing through hotel stays, night-to-night placements, and overnight stays in offices. So there's a whole host you can see here of investments, such as adolescent transitional housing, funding for implementation and monitoring. So the department is required to develop an implementation report and then monitor it to ensure that we're meeting all of the requirements as outlined in the settlement agreement. Funding is provided for a hub home model to further develop, adopt, and expand the existing hub home model that we have today here at DCYF. Licensing standards to establish a new negotiated rulemaking method to align and update the foster care and group care licensing standards. Referrals and transitions to develop and implement a new referrals and transitions protocols. Therapeutic foster care to develop and implement a professional therapeutic foster care contract and a new licensing category. Qualified residential treatment. This is to conduct assessments for children and youth prior to placement in a QRTP, and every 90 days for the duration of the placement, the assessments required. Okay, licensed kinship placements. This is one we're also really excited to see investment in, as this is an initiative that's very important to the agency. And House Bill 1227, the Keeping Families Together Act, will be in effect July 1st. And within that bill, it requires initial licenses, which is a foster care maintenance payment to be provided to kinship caregivers for up to 90 days. So that was funded. And with that additional initial license, we've also received funding for our licensing staff. And then also we received some additional FTE for our kinship caregiver engagement unit. What this unit does is they really help our kinship families navigate through the licensing process. So very excited to see these investments here. Okay, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So CWIS and SSPS replacement. These are some IT investments. CWIS is a comprehensive child welfare information system. That is the federal title. It is our FamLink system. It's our child welfare case management system. We received funding to complete a feasibility study. So then that will tell us the funding that's needed to implement a CWIS system. This is the same case with our SSPS system. This is our social service payment system. Most of our child welfare and early learning payments are made from this system. So it's a very old, antiquated system, reached its useful life. And so this funding will provide investment to complete that feasibility study that is very much needed. Okay, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Additional investments that we received. This session is to continue a prevention pilot for the purpose of preventing child abuse and neglect in Pierce County. One-time funding is received for a foster youth mentoring pilot. Funding is provided to children's advocacy centers. Funding is provided to increase the new foster home licensing incentive payment for child placing agencies to $1,000 per family that's licensed. Funding is provided for the department to develop a plan on how we will discontinue utilizing SSI payments in offsetting cost of care. Okay, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Funding was also provided to provide a $50 per month per youth increase in the basic foster care maintenance payment, as well as a supervised independent living payment for those youth that are in extended foster care. Funding is provided for an increase to our independent living service providers. One-time funding was also provided for 3 different feasibility studies pertaining to child benefits, and one-time funding was provided for foster care educational outreach. Okay, that concludes all of the child welfare and prevention investments that DCYF received this session. So now I will turn it over to Allison to review our JR bills.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Renee. And folks, just as if you have questions, continue to feel free to type them in. I've answered a couple in writing, but feel free to add them as we go. There will likely be time at the end because we are flying through these. So this slide here shows an overview of the pieces of legislation that passed that impacted the juvenile justice space for our clients and ourselves. The first is around legal fines and obligations. This just eliminates the crime victim penalty assessment for juveniles and prohibits courts from imposing any fine or fee cost to juveniles or their parents. We see this as a huge win for the clients that interface with our systems. Also, 1324 makes changes to the scoring of prior juvenile offenses in sentencing range calculations. I am not going to pretend to be an expert and try to go any further in the weeds than that. Sentencing scores is beyond my knowledge base today, but excited to see positive changes. I know this was reading something last night, well stakeholdered, well advocated for, will move forward, and it does not do retroactive work. That is one piece that did not make it in the final bill, but moving forward. So that's exciting. 1394 really was a comprehensive look at how do you create a developmentally appropriate response to youth who commit sexual offenses. So it does a variety of things related to sentencing, related to registration. DCYF's role is really to administer a grant program to counties that they can apply for to offer developmentally appropriate diversion options for young people for youth who do commit sexual offenses. And so DCYF will administer that. And then the last one is 1701, which relates to institutional education. It is the next sort of step in what has been a multi-year journey, third piece of legislation around how do we solve the structural and funding challenges that exist in delivery of education to young people who are incarcerated, frankly, throughout the juvenile justice system, most relevant to DCYF, that's in JR and in our community facility relationships, but really education access across that entire continuum, beginning at diversion and detention levels as well. So directs OSPI to do some work. We remain active partners. Huge shout out to the IE team and the JR team there. There was a giant learning summit yesterday hosted at our headquarter office on IE. And this was certainly a topic there. So we're optimistic and hopeful that things will result from this. So with that, I will turn it back over to Renee to go through the JR investments.
Thank you, Allison. As requested in our capital decision package included in the governor's budget and now ultimately passed by the legislature, an expansion of our JR community capacity and funding is provided at our Green Hill School for minimum security transitional living centers. Okay, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Also, a capital request was funding at Echo Glen for some security enhancements. This includes a perimeter fence with some security cameras, as well as some other security enhancements. So really excited to see this investment as it helps ensure the safety of our staff and the young people here at Echo Glen. Okay, we can go to the next slide. JR improving educational outcomes. This is critical for implementation of House Bill 1295. Staffing is provided to DCYF to build out the infrastructure that's necessary to support the implementation and accountability of a state level institutional education program. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Other investments in JR include, as I noted under child welfare slides, funding is provided for housing case management supports for those youth and young people exiting our JR system. NACEL Youth Camp, the NACEL Youth Camp is now closed, so we've received funding to maintain the warm closure of that facility, although the budget does require us to enter into an agreement with DSHS to maintain that warm closure. Reinvestment from the NACEL Youth Camp closure. So we did just see a reduction in our budget, just simply that we're no longer operating that facility, no longer have youth there. But some of that funding was reinvested to both Echo Glen and Green Hill. So excited to see that those investments will help us to help meet our PREA standards. Also received funding for Kitsap County mentorship. Okay, we can go to the next slide. One-time grant funding was received for therapeutic gaming rehabilitation services. Also wanted to note, this is not in DCYF's budget, but it is funded through the Secretary of State, a Washington State Library branch at Green Hill School. So very excited to see that investment. Funding was also provided for the Washington Partnership Council for Juvenile Justice. This includes establishing a state-funded community compensation program. Also a funding increase for Team Child. And we also received funding to provide some mentorship services to youth ages 12 through 19. Okay, we can go to the next slide and I will turn it over to Allison to review our early learning bills and early learning investments.
And your vocal cords can take a break.
Yes.
Just a couple of questions in the chat before we move too far along. There's a question about the percent increase to ISL providers. I don't know if we know the answer to that yet.
Yeah, we do not know that yet.
Okay. Yep. We do not know what the percent will be, but there was an increase, so that's good. Are the Teen Child Services for JR leaving youth? My read are not. This is for youth that are involved in juvenile justice, but it's not specific for JR youth. We submitted a decision package 2 years ago that fully funded legal representation for young people involved in JR under our care and custody. This is a separate proviso and a separate body of work from that for Teen Child directly for legal services and other services that they have. The JR youth piece is already funded, I guess is the short answer there. Okay, I'm going to walk through some of the early learning bills and early learning highlights. So the first one I'll talk about is Working Connections Access. So 5225, increased access to Working Connections. This increased access and eligibility for employers in childcare and children of undocumented families who need access to childcare. Sorry, there are semi trucks going up and down my road, if you can hear that. So we're excited to see expansion of continued increased access to the child care subsidy program. 5316 permanently waives the background check fees for childcare providers as well as group care providers. Folks will remember during the pandemic, there were temporary waives to these fees. This bill codifies and makes permanent that. What it does not do, which was in an early draft, I just want to be clear, is it does not permanently waive the licensing fees for childcare. So effective July 1, licensing fees will go back live. The legislature, through negotiation, the final version did not include that. 1525, the apprenticeships in childcare. This creates eligibility for apprentices, those in a state registered apprenticeship, to access the Working Connections Child Care Subsidy and maintain that continuity of care through their apprenticeship in the first year of their apprenticeship program. 1199 contemplates family child care operations in HOA areas. This is a technical bill that clarifies that family child care providers can operate within HOAs. This was a partnership of family child care providers, the union, HOAs. So we're excited to see some clarity. There are some issues arising, and so we're excited to see this codified. One bill that got deleted, and we'll make sure to get added back before we post these, was 1550 concerning transitional kindergarten. Just want to be clear, that bill did pass, directs some rulemaking at OSPI around the transition to kindergarten program and codifies transition to kindergarten. This is a program that districts can run that serves 4-year-olds who turn 5, not yet in kindergarten. Directs rulemaking, alignment of some quality standards, etc. So want to note that not direct impact to DCYF, although we are contemplated in that bill as partners in rulemaking and some other pieces, but certainly connects with the early learning system and the populations we serve. So I'm going to talk through the early learning investments, starting at our decision packages and then moving into sort of other investments. The first slide here, or decision packages and governor's budget investments. The first slide here highlights 3 grant programs that were funded by the legislature. It increases investments in the current childcare complex needs and the equity grants, as well as establishes a new grant program focused on tribal early learning providers and providers who are serving tribal children, really focused on how do we enhance responsive care, both of providers who serve tribal children and tribal providers themselves. So increased investment in 2 grant program and creation of a new grant program in the tribal early learning grants. Next slide. This contemplates our Working Connections childcare rate increases and changes. So the first is Working Connections childcare rates increased to the 85th percentile of the 21 market rate survey. This was a commitment made in Fair Start for Kids Act. It was fully funded. We're thrilled to see that. Additionally, when the legislature included a 16% rate increase last year, there were a few areas of the state and a few ages that went over that 85th percentile threshold of the 21 market rate survey. So the legislature made a choice to say no one's rate would be reduced. So if you are over that, you will maintain that. That's what the second line here is, the hold harmless. And then everyone else will come up to that 85th percentile of the market rate, of the 21 market rate survey. The legislature also funded, which was an ask from the department, the changes to the homeless grace period. It removes the restriction on 1 12-month homeless grace period. For families who are still working to remediate homelessness, that continuity of childcare can be so important. And so this allows families who are still working on homeless mitigation to maintain their childcare if their 12-month authorization window comes open or up. And then the last piece was the non-standard hours rate bonus. The legislature funded an increase of $135 per month per child for care in non-standard hours. So this is evening care, this is weekend care, this is care in those non-traditional hours. And so excited to see the legislature invest there. A couple questions I'm going to answer here before we move on, just in the sense of connectedness and continuity here. On average, what kind of rate increase will most providers see based on the 85th percentile? I don't know that answer off the top of my head. We will have rate charts published really soon. The team is actively working on getting that all programmed in SSPS and getting those rate charts out and the notice out. So keep watching for that. I don't know it off the top of my head, and I don't want to misspeak forthcoming. And then there's a specific question around the implementation of 5225. Is the 85th percent SMI eligibility requirement only for childcare employees, or is it raising that percentage for others as well? Specific to 5225, the 85% SMI change is specific to childcare employees. Folks will recall, as part of the Fair Start for Kids Act, the general eligibility to working connections increases over time over the next couple of years, the percentage. This bill says that for childcare employees, between what is currently eligible, they can go up, they'll be eligible if they're up to the 85% of SMI. And then the general, the sort of everyone else at 85% SMI kicks in per Fair Start in a few years. I don't know off the top of my head. We can follow up with sort of a more sort of cheat sheet around what's coming with Fair Start for Kids Act and how this intersects. But this bill is specific to the childcare employee population and not the general population. Go ahead and go to the next slide. This slide contemplates some other elements included in the collective bargaining agreement. As a reminder, family child care providers are organized under SEIU 925. They bargain and negotiate with the state through collective bargaining process that is included in the budget. This collective bargaining agreement was fully funded. It did include the 85th percentile of rates. That total dollar amount was captured on the previous slide. This also includes a couple other things, background checks. It includes the cost of care enhancement that was negotiated in during the pandemic. So that cost of care enhancement continues and increases slightly for family child care providers, and a couple other pieces funded in the CBA. Thrilled to see this fully funded. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So ECEAP, elements of ECEAP that were funded and increased. We see rate increases for all types of ECEAP slots. We see an 18% rate increase for full day or school day slots and a 9% rate increase for the extended day or working day slot. Those go into effect July 1. That'll be an average rate increase, I should say there. Those go into effect July 1 of this year. And then there's a 7% rate increase for part day slots that goes into effect fiscal year 24. So that will be next year as well. We also see slot expansion. 1,000 slots are converted from part day to school day. And then we see slots added in fiscal years 26 or 24 through 27. So some slot conversion and slot expansion happening there, moving more part day to school day, adding more school day and extended day online. We see increases to the complex needs grant program for ECEAP. This has some base funding and we see an increase there. Demand has outpaced available resource in this, like the other grant programs as well. Thrilled to see this. And then we see funding for early ECEAP. We see a rate increase for early ECEAP and resource to maintain the existing early ECEAP slots that were previously funded by the Preschool Development Grant. Go ahead and go to the next slide. A couple of years ago, last year, 2 years ago, you'll remember the again, with my years, I should just not comment on them. The organizational license pilot was included as a proviso, and it funded 2 years in the 21-23 operating budget. This is a pilot that is DCYF is leading in partnership with organizations who offer childcare, municipalities, school districts, corporations or providers that have multiple sites to say, are there ways to streamline our licensing process when an organization is in charge of multiple sites or multiple classrooms? We are working through that pilot, yielding promising results. Not quite ready to go live. We need a little bit more resource for a third year and to begin some implementation before we're ready to contemplate how we would codify this in our CW. So this provides that ongoing funding for that third year, and we're excited to see this work continue. And then the Early Learning Facilities Fund, again, this is a grant administered through the Department of Commerce, but we submit the decision package. And so we see pretty substantial investments in the Early Learning Facilities Fund, which is really exciting. $42 million in the competitive grant process and $5 million in the minor renovations. And I'm really sorry if you can hear my dogs. So excited to see continued investment here. We administer this in partnership with Commerce, but the bulk of the work flows through the Department of Commerce. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So some other investments in early learning that were funded in the budget, the Imagination Library received $2 million. ECEAP providers or early support for infants and toddlers received a rate increase, unclear exactly the percent or how that will shake out, but there's some direction from the legislature about how to use those dollars for that rate enhancement for ECEAP providers. We see increased investment in data tools through a partnership with WASTEM. This is really about tracking our equity goals and outcomes related to early learning and partnering to ensure there's usability dashboards and data available around early learning access, early learning funding, etc. The Washington Communities for Children receives a $2 million investment. This again was work that began under the preschool development grant. That preschool development grant funding is going away. And so the legislature invests one time in a $2 million investment there. Next slide. We see a proviso that directs the department to work in partnership to make recommendations and an implementation plan around expanding access to Washington's mixed delivery early learning system. As a reminder, the only real lever we have around family eligibility and resource into early learning settings, licensed childcare, we have ECEAP certainly, but on the childcare side, the real only lever is subsidy. And so that's really dictated by who's eligible and the rate. And so this says, why don't you tell us how we do it to get more families eligible? Folks will remember Patty Murray had some federal legislation and Build Back Better that really contemplated this. And so really picking up some of those threads of what does it look like to move to a more universal-based mixed delivery system that provides more resource for more families to access high quality care and frankly, more higher rates and more compensation for the workforce and early learning providers. So we're excited to take on this work in partnership with some external partners who are doing some great work as well in the space. One-time funding is provided to contract with an entity to continue to expand peer mentorship programs to bring on childcare businesses. This is done through a partnership with the Imagine Institute that's been operational for a while. And there's a wait list. And so this will help continue to grow the availability of childcare. And then there was a specific request of $400,000 to one early learning provider in King County. The launch program, the launch learning organization, one-time operational request that was funded that will move out the door. I want to go ahead and go to the next slide. Oh, there's a question about ECEAP. I'm sorry. Thanks for the overview. When might ECEAP providers learn how much each of them would receive as a result of this rate enhancement? Great question. We are still, as you can see, working through the volume of investments internally, just so folks know we're working through scoping meetings, unpacking budgets. What does it look like for contract amendments, et cetera, with program and fiscal and the GA team and outreach. And so more to come. The budget doesn't go into effect till after July and when it's signed. And so more to come as we work through that. I imagine, I won't speak for Renee, but I know her team and program teams are working as quickly as possible to implement some of these things. And so I would be on the lookout for updates in later June and early July, as far as just sort of globally, generally, not specific to ECEAP, but sort of on all the implementation pieces. The last decision package I'll talk about is culturally relevant language access. This was a decision package we submitted that really is about how do we better our infrastructure and improve our language access availability, living into our equity. We know we have clients and providers who serve a variety of languages, and we can't often meet their needs, and we just frankly need to do better. And doing better takes some resource and some infrastructure and some intentionality. We developed a language access plan as an agency a couple of years ago that had a number of recommendations in it. This decision package funds those, works on translation, staff, so that human connection, website updates, technical resources, et cetera. So we're excited to see this work, which is really just do work of state government, but takes resource and necessary to do, funded, and are excited to begin implementing. I think that concludes. Oh, and I'll turn it over to Renee, just in case there's anyone who's interested. There are some staffing investments for state employees, and Renee can highlight those briefly.
All right. Thanks, Allison. Yes, just quickly. So as was included in the governor's budget and now ultimately funded, passed by the legislature, are investments in state employees. There's a general wage increase that goes into effect this July of 4%. Next July, an increase of 3%. Also, state employees will receive a one-time lump sum payment if they can show verification that they're up to date with their COVID-19 vaccinations and boosters. And then also state employees will receive a $1,000 one-time lump sum payment for recognition and retention for those employees that were hired before July 1st of 2022 and still employed with no break in service as of July 1st, 2023. There's some additional investments also related to staffing that I won't go into the details of those, but just to know and note that as investment was provided for providers and continued and enhanced service delivery, stability, et cetera, also funding was provided for state employees. Okay, and I think, yes, that concludes our webinar. We got through it. Thank you so much for your time. Just really appreciate you all and appreciate your partnership.
We have about 10 minutes left. Feel free to continue to use the Q&A box and type questions into the chat. We'll hang on and see if there's any other questions that come in. There is the beginnings of a question, and I'm now on pins and needles. Let's see what it says. And I'm sorry, my dogs are barking again because, you know, the wind is blowing. Are ESDs included in the COVID incentive payment? I have no idea and would not be able to answer. I don't think Renee or I would be able to answer that question. You'll need to check in with, if you're an ESD employee, with your local HR. I am not sure how that incentive payment intersects with ESDs in school districts. House Bill 1199, is there any rectifying for providers who have been paying fees to HOAs to keep their doors open? That is beyond a DCYF measure. We would not be involved in financial transactions between individual businesses and HOAs or authorities. You would have to look into that with your HOA. We would not be able, that would not be a DCYF involved process. And I'm not sure it was contemplated in the legislation. Will the recording or only slides be posted later? You know, I always forget what gets posted, to be honest. But on our website, the slides certainly are posted as a PDF. I can't remember if the recording gets posted or not. It may. But the slides will certainly be posted, and then feel free to reach out if there's any additional questions. Can you talk about the timeline for implementation of these new initiatives? I certainly can, Lori. This is a lot of work. We're implementing a lot of work. And so, you know, things take time. Things take time to do them well. Many of the things that passed fit into existing project charters, existing initiatives. That's great. Some of the things are new. Some of the things are different, and they have deadlines and timelines. We're working as quickly as we can. My team has hosted, I think, 65 scoping meetings is the last count I got, and nearly all the scoping meetings are complete. So we host an internal meeting, pulling all the right players together internally to get everyone on the same page to understand timelines, funding realities, who's on first, what we're doing. So most of those have been completed as of this week. And so that's really exciting. That's really the first step in that process. And implementation conversations are underway and moving forward. Generally, work is happening and things aren't going to happen overnight or on a dime, as folks know, especially as we have to procure or make system changes to things. For some of the things that happened, like family time rate increases that happened this year, those are going live. I don't know, Renee, if you want to speak to some of those fiscal things and those rate increases that are sometimes a little more cut and dry and easier to turn on and off.
Yeah, I would just add that we are certainly acting very swiftly to implement and implementing as best we can based on when funding is effective. So there was a few areas where we noted funding was effective January 1st, not July 1st. And so just acting very quickly to just implement based on when our funding becomes available.
If I switched agencies, am I still eligible for the payment? I'm assuming this is a state employee who's asking about the state employee incentive. And as long as there was no disruption in service,
yes,
and you are a state employee, you are eligible.
Correct. That is correct.
State employee, not for private providers. Just want to be clear about that. Yep. For the mentoring funding and Kitsap County JR funding, was there funding directed where is this funding directed locally? This was for Credible Messengers. It's really clearly called out that this is a Credible Messengers investment in the legislature, by the legislature. And Lori, thank you for the softball. I will take the opportunity to talk about this. And while all of this work is going on and all of the work from previous years, you are exactly correct. We are also building our decision packages and our agency request legislation for the 24 legislative session. We are well into that process. Ideas have been generated, stakeholder work has begun, and so continue to be on the lookout for opportunities to inform and learn about the decision packages and agency request legislation that we are considering. As a reminder, for state agency land, those are due in September. That means we are really busy in June and July and August as we implement and we close books and we cost allocate and we write law, draft law, and we work with the governor's office and OFM, and we submit these things in September. So we're actively working on that right now. So be on the lookout for opportunities to engage. When is the $50 increase to the basic foster care rate going into effect, July or January? I don't know that off the top of my head. Renee, do you know?
I would need to confirm that as well. Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head.
We will loop back on that.
Yeah.
All right. Not seeing any more questions coming in. And can you talk about the process for stakeholders to work with DCYF to include new policies in your 2024 decision packages and legislative proposals? Yeah, so we have started doing stakeholder outreach through advisory bodies, through informal conversations. Programs have been doing that ongoing, as well as my team, GA team, and community engagement team. Now is the time. We are sort of building those concepts and building those concepts now. I will remind folks, the 24 legislative session is a supplemental legislative session. The asks the agency will put forward next year will be small. They will be narrow. It is a supplemental year. It is not a biennial year. So now is also a great time to be having conversations, dare I say it, about the next biennial budget with agency staff, with program staff, with the government affairs team, with the engagement team. We are really thinking about a 2 to 5 year cycle on what we're looking to go ask for. We recognize, and this year the proof was in the pudding, we recognize that when there's robust engagement, buy-in, and partnership with our stakeholders and allies, it is much easier to get things across the finish line. That is my preferred approach to the legislative arena. And so we are starting conversations about the next biennial budget. So if you don't see something on a list for the 24 supplemental, that doesn't mean it's not an option or it's off the table. That just means a supplemental ask might not be the right time for something. So we will begin to host sort of general webinars around those packages probably in the next month or so as they evolve after a June 5th check-in, sort of that are general of what's cooking across the broad spectrum, but certainly keep in touch with our advisory bodies, other stakeholder groups that are meeting. We will start those, have begun, and will continue those conversations as we refine and build. And idea generation should be ongoing. We are trying to really lean into the fact that like the legislature comes to town every January, and we should be ready for that. But we also should be generating ideas and contemplating new policy options throughout, refining ideas. So we're ready to pop into the legislative session that makes the most sense, both, long or short. Political opportunity. Is there a champion? What's the ways the wind blowing? Some of those pieces. So idea generation is ongoing. Again, if you don't see something on the supplemental ask, don't be alarmed. Don't be discouraged. Let's keep the conversation going for a potential biennial ask, especially if it's a bigger, more reformative thing. All right, well, with that, it is 11 o'clock. I will just say a huge thank you to everyone for joining. I take great joy in doing these webinars with all of you and alongside Renee, especially when they're this positive and this exciting. Please reach out with questions, and we are sort of onward marching towards implementation in next year. Appreciate everyone's time today.